Welcome to the channel. In this video, we're uncovering every execution carried out across the United States during the first 2 months of 2025. Who were these prisoners? What crimes sealed their fate? And what were their final words, their last meals, and their final moments? From death row to the execution chamber, we walk you through every case from January and February. This is every execution in America and the stories behind them. On January 31st, 2025, after 22 years on death row, Marion Bowman Jr. was executed by lethal injection at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, the first execution in the U.S. that year. Candy Martin, 21, was found dead on February 17, 2001. Her body was discovered in the trunk of her burned-out car in rural Dorchester County, South Carolina. The vehicle had been set ablaze in a wooded area, and the body inside was charred beyond recognition. The day before, Martin had last been seen alive. Autopsy reports confirmed she had been shot twice, once in the back and once in the head, before being left in the woods overnight. Then, sometime after her death, her body was placed in the trunk of her own car and torched. Within 24 hours, police arrested Marion Bowman Jr., a former high school acquaintance of Martin. Prosecutors claimed the motive was rooted in a $150 drug debt, a sum Martin allegedly owed Bowman for crack cocaine. But others suggested a more sinister motive. Bowman reportedly told friends he suspected Martin was working with law enforcement, possibly wearing a wire. Still, there was no forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no surveillance footage, only a network of witnesses, mostly family and friends of Bowman, who agreed to testify in exchange for leniency in their own legal troubles. Could the murder of Candy Martin have been orchestrated by someone else, shielded behind a series of plea deals? Bowman's conviction rested entirely on testimony. The prosecution presented multiple witnesses, several of whom were facing charges themselves. His cousin, James Taiwan Gadsden, testified that he had witnessed the shooting firsthand. Another relative admitted to helping dispose of the weapon. Friends said Bowman confessed to them. Each of these witnesses received either reduced sentences, immunity, or plea bargains in exchange for their cooperation. Bowman's defense argued these testimonies were unreliable, driven by self-preservation and devoid of supporting evidence. No DNA, no ballistics, no gun. Nothing material tied Bowman to the crime scene. The state's entire case stood on the credibility of witnesses with a vested interest in Bowman's conviction. Was this justice or convenience? In 2002, Bowman stood trial for murder and third-degree arson. He declined a plea deal that would have spared his life and insisted on his innocence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. He was sentenced to death that same day. Over the following 2 decades, Bowman's appeals focused on claims of ineffective counsel, racial bias, and suppressed evidence. His attorneys alleged that his original lawyer believed a black man accused of killing a white woman had no chance before a jury, and thus failed to properly defend him. They also argued that the prosecution withheld potentially exculpatory information, contradictions in witness statements, evidence that undermined credibility, and psychological evaluations that cast doubt on a key witness's testimony. The South Carolina Supreme Court rejected all appeals, calling the claims meritless. By January 3, 2025, an execution date was set. Bowman chose lethal injection, one of 3 methods legally available in the state. After 22 years of fighting the system, the clock ran out. Bowman had chosen his last meal earlier that day, a feast of fried shrimp, oysters, fish, chicken wings, tenders, onion rings, banana pudding, and German chocolate cake, washed down with cranberry and pineapple juice. Prison officials said he ate most of it. In the final hours of his life, Marion Bowman Jr. remained composed and silent, a demeanor that had defined much of his time on death row. According to prison officials and media witnesses, he showed no signs of fear, panic, or emotional breakdown. His behavior was described as calm, alert, and resolute. Bowman declined to meet with a spiritual advisor and did not request any additional time with family. He also refused a final phone call to the governor to request clemency, a move his attorney later described as intentional. Bowman, they said, viewed the clemency process as a formality rooted in a system that never gave him a chance. His refusal was interpreted not as hopelessness, but as defiance, a rejection of the justice system that condemned him. As he entered the execution chamber, Bowman walked steadily and without assistance. He made no verbal statements, asked no questions, and offered no eye contact with witnesses in the gallery. He lay down on the gurney without resistance and remained still as prison staff secured the straps. When the injection began at 6:07 p.m., his breathing intensified briefly, described by witnesses as deep and heavy, lasting less than a minute. His face remained passive, his eyes closed. There were no visible signs of distress, struggle, or pain. His respiration slowed until it ceased. He was declared dead 20 minutes later. Throughout the process, Bowman never cried, never apologized, and never lashed out. If he feared death, he did not show it. If he believed he was innocent, he took that belief with him. Unshaken, he did not speak. Instead, his attorney read aloud a final statement. "I did not kill Candy Martin. I'm innocent of the crimes I'm here to die for. I hope this brings peace to her family." The statement ended with a short poem he had written in his cell, one that prison officials refused to release in full. According to his attorney, it was a reflection on pain, redemption, and being unheard. Bowman's final moments were quiet. No tears, no defiance, only silence. Was it the silence of acceptance, or the silence of a man who had spent 22 years being ignored? Just 5 days after South Carolina carried out its first execution in over a decade, Texas resumed its own capital punishment schedule, with a case that brought lingering doubts to the very end. On February 5, 2025, after 13 years on Texas's death row, Stephen LaWayne Nelson was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit for the 2011 church murder of Pastor Clint Dobson, a killing he claimed he didn't commit, even in his final moments. Pastor Clint Dobson was only 28 years old when he was killed inside his own church, a sacred space violated in broad daylight. On the morning of March 3, 2011, Dobson and 69-year-old Secretary Judy Elliott were working at North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. According to security logs and church records, the day began routinely. But sometime before noon, that calm was shattered. Dobson was brutally beaten, strangled with a computer cord, and suffocated with a plastic bag tightly bound around his head. Elliott was also attacked and left for dead, beaten so viciously that even her husband failed to recognize her face in the hospital. The attacker fled with a laptop, cell phone, credit cards, and Dobson's car. Police found no signs of forced entry, suggesting the assailant was either known to the victims or had caught them completely off guard. It wasn't a clean crime. Blood was splattered across the office. A broken belt lay nearby. Surveillance footage later showed someone using the stolen cards and driving the missing vehicle. When Stephen LaWayne Nelson was arrested, he denied killing anyone. He admitted to being present, but claimed he only served as a lookout while 2 unnamed men carried out the violence. Was this a confession or a deflection? Could the truth be more complicated than it seemed? The forensic trail was damning. Nelson's fingerprints were lifted from multiple surfaces inside the church. Blood from both Dobson and Elliott was found on his shoes. Surveillance video showed him driving Dobson's stolen Mazda and making purchases with the church's credit cards. Witnesses also testified that Nelson attempted to sell stolen items shortly after the crime. The belt found near Dobson's body matched the bruising on his neck, and DNA linked it to Nelson. No other suspects were identified. The 2 men Nelson blamed were investigated and quickly cleared. They had solid alibis backed by witnesses and location data. Despite these findings, the case was not without controversy. Nelson's own confession conflicted with the physical evidence, yet the prosecution never conclusively proved how the murder unfolded. Could his role have been exaggerated by prosecutors? Or was his lookout story just a self-serving fabrication to avoid death? The trial began in Tarrant County on October 1, 2012. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, portraying Nelson as a violent, remorseless killer who had targeted a house of worship for robbery. The defense argued otherwise, that Nelson did not commit the murder, had not planned the killing, and was being used as a scapegoat to close a high-profile case. Nelson himself testified, insisting that the fatal blows were delivered by someone else, an assertion the jury found unconvincing. On October 8, 2012, he was convicted of capital murder. By October 16th, the death sentence was handed down. For more than a decade, Nelson pursued appeals, citing ineffective assistance of counsel and insufficient evidence of intent to kill. His petitions were denied by both state and federal courts. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to review his case. With all legal avenues exhausted, a death warrant was issued in June 2024. But the question persisted. Was this a man punished for the murder or for being at the wrong place, with the wrong motive, at the worst possible time? Under Texas policy, Nelson received no special last meal. He ate the same institutional food served to all inmates on the day of his execution. Stephen LaWayne Nelson spent his final hours with striking emotional control. Unlike many condemned inmates, there were no erratic outbursts, no tears, no public appeals. He declined a special last meal under Texas policy, accepting the regular prison fare without protest. In the holding cell, he reportedly remained composed, reading, meditating, and speaking quietly with his spiritual advisor. Prison officials described him as calm but resolved. Guards noticed he had been unusually still during final checks. No pacing, no hesitation. It was as if he had rehearsed this. When brought to the execution chamber, Nelson did not resist or falter. Strapped to the gurney, he made steady eye contact with his wife, who watched from behind the glass. Their connection was silent but unbroken. His last words were reserved for her. "I love you. I love you. I love you." Then, glancing at the warden, he said simply, "Let's ride, warden." At 6:26 p.m., a single dose of pentobarbital was administered. Over the next 24 minutes, Nelson's body gradually stilled. His breathing slowed, then ceased. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. No apology, no mention of the crime, no final admission. Was this acceptance, or defiance, peace, or denial? The stillness in Nelson's final hours raises an unsettling question. Did he face death with the serenity of a guilty man who made peace, or the quiet confidence of someone convinced he didn't deserve to die? Less than 24 hours later, another execution made history, not for the crime, but for the method. On February 6, 2025, after 33 years on death row, convicted serial rapist and double murderer Demetrius Terrence Frazier was executed by nitrogen hypoxia at Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility, becoming one of the first inmates in U.S. history to die by this controversial method. Pauline Brown, 40, was found dead in her Birmingham, Alabama apartment on November 27, 1991, the day before Thanksgiving. She had been shot in the head and robbed at gunpoint. The scene showed no signs of struggle beyond the brutal final act. Her bedroom was intact, her purse partially emptied, and the room was quiet when family found her body, fully clothed, lying still, eyes open. But Pauline's death was only one chapter in a longer, darker story. Just months earlier, on September 1, 1991, Demetrius Frazier committed two separate and an armed robbery in Michigan. In each case, the victim reported a forced intrusion, a weapon, and sexual violence. Frazier operated alone. He was calm, deliberate, and vicious. The crimes occurred within days of one another, signaling either an escalating psychological unraveling or a calculated hunt. Then, in March 1992, a 14-year-old girl named Crystal Kendrick was found dead near an alley in Detroit. She had been shot in the head. Investigators learned she had been lured into a secluded area under false pretenses. Frazier admitted he had tried to rape her. When she resisted, he executed her. He was arrested for Crystal's murder and during interrogation voluntarily confessed to Pauline Brown's killing in Alabama. In under 7 months, Demetrius Frazier had committed at least 2 rapes, 1 armed robbery, and 2 murders, all against women and girls across multiple states. The pattern was clear: sexual violence, followed by fatal violence. His victims were vulnerable, alone, and targeted at moments of privacy. What he couldn't control through fear, he destroyed with force. Despite his confessions, investigators remained haunted by one question: were there more? The confession to Birmingham authorities was critical. Frazier gave details only the killer could know. He described the location of the apartment, the amount of money stolen, and the sequence of events. Though DNA testing was limited at the time, the victim's injuries and forensic evidence matched his story. His violent record in Michigan supported the prosecution's case. In April 1993, he received 2 life sentences for murdering Crystal Kendrick. By October, He was sentenced to 2 more life terms and 60 to 90 years for the 2 earlier Michigan rapes and the armed robbery. In Alabama, his trial was a formality. He faced a capital murder charge under a murder during robbery statute, an aggravator that made the death penalty eligible. But the trial exposed the cracks in the system. His court-appointed defense received only $1,000 for out-of-court preparation. They called no witnesses. They made no attempt to challenge the confession or investigate mitigating factors. Instead, they conceded his guilt in front of the jury. He was convicted in 1996. Yet the lack of a robust defense and the reliance on a confession without DNA left questions lingering about due process, race, and whether justice in Alabama had been too swift to kill. Frazier's appeals span nearly 3 decades. Demetrius Frazier never publicly expressed a motive for his crimes. In court, he gave no explanation. In appeals, his defense did not argue insanity, mental illness, or personal grievance. His legal team later argued that he should never have been transferred from Michigan, a state without the death penalty, to Alabama for execution. They also challenged the racial composition of his jury. 10 white jurors, 2 black, and a 10-2 vote in favor of the death sentence, a process now outlawed in most of the country. One of his appeals targeted Alabama's method of execution itself. Frazier's lawyers claimed nitrogen hypoxia, a method still in experimental stages, posed a risk of prolonged suffering and violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. None of the arguments persuaded the courts. In January 2025, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey signed his execution order. The Supreme Court declined to intervene. Demetrius Frazier's last meal was fast food from Taco Bell, a beefy 5-layer burrito, chicken chalupa supreme, 2 beef crunchy tacos, nachos with dip, and a Mountain Dew. He ate in full. At 6 p.m. on February 6, 2025, Frazier was led into Alabama's execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. A mask was fixed tightly over his face. This mask would not deliver lethal drugs, but pure nitrogen, an odorless gas designed to replace the oxygen in his lungs, causing unconsciousness through hypoxia. The state initiated the flow of nitrogen. Within seconds, witnesses observed visible distress. Frazier's body twitched, his face contorted. He began quivering and appeared to gasp for breath. This continued for 4 to 5 minutes, far longer than traditional lethal injections, where unconsciousness typically sets in within 30 seconds. At 6:36 p.m., after 26 minutes, Demetrius Terrence Frazier was declared dead. In his final statement, he said, "What happened to Pauline Brown should have never happened." He then criticized Michigan's governor for allowing the transfer and left one last message: "Detroit strong. I love everybody on death row. Let's go." His final moments projected remorse, rage, and allegiance. Remorse for the victim, rage at the system, and solidarity with those awaiting the same fate. But the gas mask left one final image: a man grimacing in silence, his breath stolen not by a bullet, but by a system designed to kill without blood. Was justice served or simply completed? A week later, Florida carried out its first execution of the year, ending a case that had remained unresolved in the public's mind for nearly 3 decades. On February 13, 2025, after over a quarter-century on death row, 64-year-old James Dennis Ford was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison, closing the book on a double murder that had haunted Charlotte County since 1997. On April 6, 1997, Gregory and Kimberly Malnory, a working-class couple in their 20s, joined James Ford, Gregory's co-worker, for what appeared to be a casual fishing trip at a sod farm in Charlotte County, Florida. It was a Sunday afternoon. The couple brought their 22-month-old daughter along. Ford had invited them out personally. There was no conflict, no known grudge. By the next morning, both adults were dead. Gregory was attacked first, shot at close range, beaten with a blunt object, and left with his throat slit. The sheer violence of the attack suggested more than impulse, it suggested planning. Kimberly was then isolated. She was raped and executed by gunshot. Their toddler was found 18 hours later, alone but alive inside the family truck. The scene was cold and controlled. No valuables were stolen. There was no sign of an argument, no signs of panic. Ford never attempted to flee. When questioned by police, he gave inconsistent statements but denied involvement. He returned to work, maintaining a disturbing calm. Why did James Ford kill a man he worked beside, a woman who trusted him, and spare a child too young to speak? To this day, no definitive motive has ever been established. Prosecutors argued it was a premeditated act, possibly sexually motivated, or born from some internal resentment never voiced. Ford never confessed. He never explained why. Why would a man invite a coworker and his wife into an isolated field, then carry out 2 calculated murders and walk away in silence? The prosecution built its case on a web of circumstantial and forensic threads. Ford was the last person seen with the couple. His story shifted with each police interview. Most damning, however, was the DNA evidence, biological material recovered from Kimberly's body directly linked to Ford, corroborating the rape and tying him to the scene. Still, there were gaps. No physical evidence placed him near Gregory's corpse. No weapon was ever recovered. The defense argued that the DNA only proved sexual contact, not murder. But the timeline, the brutality, and Ford's silence painted a chilling picture. Could a man commit such acts without motive, or was that the motive itself? During his 1999 trial, Ford's defense claimed he was so intoxicated at the time that he lacked the capacity for premeditation. Psychologists testified that Ford had a mental age of 14, possibly the result of long-term alcohol abuse and intellectual limitations. They portrayed him as more reckless than evil. The jury was unmoved. An 11-1 vote recommended the death penalty for both murders. The judge agreed. For more than 2 decades, Ford's attorneys filed appeals, arguing intellectual disability, ineffective counsel, and ethical concerns over Florida's evolving execution protocols. But none gained traction. The Florida Supreme Court denied multiple motions. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. In 2025, the death warrant was signed. In the final 24 hours of his life, James Dennis Ford remained largely silent. His last meal was indulgent but plain: steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato, and pumpkin pie. He finished it without comment. No visitors were listed. No religious counsel was requested. He declined to give a verbal final statement. Instead, he left a folded handwritten note in the holding cell, reading only, "Hugs, prayers, love. God bless everyone." The note, adorned with exclamation points, stood in sharp contrast to the gravity of the moment. Its tone was vague, neither reflective nor remorseful, and made no mention of the victims, their families, or the crime itself. The handwriting was described as large and somewhat childlike, possibly consistent with claims made by his defense years earlier about Ford's reduced mental capacity. When the execution chamber doors opened at 6 p.m., Ford walked in without resistance. His posture was steady. He did not speak. He lay flat on the gurney as officials strapped down his arms and legs. His expression remained blank, neither defiant nor fearful. As the first drug, etomidate, was administered, witnesses observed Ford's chest heave visibly twice. His fingers curled, then released. One media witness reported that his body briefly tensed before going completely still. His eyes remained open but unfocused. A staffer touched his face and called his name. No response. The second drug, rocuronium bromide, shut down his respiratory muscles. The final injection, potassium acetate, halted his heart. At 6:19 p.m., James Dennis Ford was pronounced dead. He was the first person executed in Florida in 2025. Only 25 people were allowed to witness his death, including members of the victims' families and selected media. The quiet ending contrasted sharply with the violence of his crimes. Was his final silence an admission, a rejection of guilt, or simply the end of a man who refused to explain himself? That same night, in a different state, Texas carried out its second execution of the month, this time for a man whose violent rampage left 4 people dead and a community shaken. On February 13, 2025, after 18 years on death row, 45-year-old Richard Tabler was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas for orchestrating a cold-blooded 4-person killing spree in 2004. The violence began on the night of November 26, 2004, Thanksgiving Day, in Killeen, Texas. Tabler, a former bouncer with a history of volatile behavior, reached out to his ex-boss, strip club manager Mohammed Amin Ramouni, 28, under the guise of a black market stereo equipment deal. With Ramouni came his friend, 25-year-old Haytham Frank Zayed. What started as a planned meeting turned into a setup. Tabler led both men to a remote stretch of road outside city limits. There he executed them with a handgun. Ramouni was shot first, and Zayed shortly after. The final bullet was filmed by Tabler's teenage accomplice, Timothy Doan Payne, using a cell phone camera. 2 days later, Tabler added 2 more names to his growing list. This time his victims were teenage girls, 16-year-old Amanda Benefield and 18-year-old Tiffany Lorraine Dotson, both dancers at the same club. Tabler lured them to Stillhouse Hollow Lake with a promise of drugs. Once there, he opened fire. Benefield was shot 3 times in the head and neck. Dotson tried to flee but was gunned down in the back. The girls' bodies were discovered dumped near the waterline, still clothed in their club attire, with multiple gunshot wounds and no signs of robbery or Did Tabler kill out of paranoia, or was it the start of something more calculated? The primary piece of evidence was Tabler himself. Just 1 day after his arrest on unrelated theft charges, he confessed voluntarily to all 4 murders. His account included details only the killer could have known and pointed investigators to key physical evidence, including shell casings and the murder weapon. Police recovered Payne's video of the Zayed execution, a grainy but damning clip that sealed the timeline. Forensic evidence matched the bullets found at both scenes. Witnesses from the strip club confirmed ongoing tension between Tabler and Ramouni, including threats Tabler had made in the weeks prior. A handwritten hit list discovered in Tabler's home named 11 additional employees from the club. Benefield and Dotson were at the top. The trial began in early 2007. During sentencing, prosecutors leaned on the premeditation and brutality of the crimes. The jury also heard about Tabler's threats against prison staff and fellow inmates while in custody. One recorded phone call included Tabler stating he would slit the throat of a jailer if given the chance. The defense argued mitigating factors: a childhood marked by neglect and physical abuse, early psychiatric institutionalization, and a brain abnormality discovered in neuroimaging. They claimed he lacked full control over his impulses and had shown signs of mental illness throughout his life. On April 2, 2007, the jury handed down a death sentence for each count of capital murder. Payne, who was 18 at the time and did not pull the trigger, received life without parole. Over the following years, Tabler alternated between cooperating with and resisting his legal team. At one point, he waived his right to all appeals, later reversed with the help of the ACLU, who argued the decision had been made without competent legal support. His final appeal was rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court in October 2024. In the hours leading up to his execution, Richard Tabler displayed an outwardly calm and composed demeanor. Prison officials noted no unusual behavior. There were no last-minute appeals, emotional breakdowns, or medical complications. He declined a special last meal, spoke politely to prison staff, and spent his final moments quietly with the chaplain. Observers described Tabler as resigned rather than anxious. His movements were controlled, his posture relaxed. He did not show visible signs of agitation, no tremors, tears, or panic. He reportedly nodded when asked to proceed and did not resist the restraints as he was secured to the gurney. Inside the death chamber, Tabler maintained eye contact with the witnesses briefly before turning his gaze upward toward the ceiling. He did not cry or shake. His breathing remained steady as the intravenous line was inserted. Moments before the lethal injection began, he delivered a clear and measured final statement. His voice was steady. His tone was reflective, not theatrical. There was no attempt to deny his crimes or shift blame. He spoke directly to the families of his victims, expressing regret and asking for forgiveness. As the pentobarbital entered his bloodstream, Tabler showed typical physiological responses associated with the drug: a slow loss of consciousness, followed by cessation of movement and respiration. There were no complications. His final words, "I am finished," were delivered with finality, not fear. Interpretation: Richard Tabler's behavior suggested full psychological acceptance of his fate. The absence of visible distress or last-minute appeals may indicate genuine remorse or a long internalized expectation of death. For a man who once threatened to kill again, the lack of defiance in his final moments was striking. Was it peace, penance, or simply psychological collapse after years of waiting to die. That concludes all executions carried out in the first 2 months of 2025. Which case shocked you the most?